Imagine the darkest night in history. The silence weighs heavily in the air as a man, sweating drops of blood, kneels among the olive trees of an ancestral garden. His friends sleep just a few meters away, unaware that, in moments, Roman soldiers will appear with torches and spears to arrest him. But this is not just a moment of betrayal or capture, it is the beginning of a journey that would change the world forever. What would have happened if Pontius Pilate had made a different decision? How did a simple trial in a remote province of the Roman Empire trigger an event that would span centuries, shaping entire civilizations? And, above all, why did such a powerful empire, seemingly unshakable, find itself compelled to yield to the message of the one condemned to death? In this story, we will delve into the conflict between Rome and Jesus of Nazareth, from his arrest in the Garden of Olives to the impact of his crucifixion on the very empire that sought to silence him. Prepare to discover how Roman brutality and Christian faith clashed, resulting in a transformation that no one could foresee. The night was heavy. The air felt charged, as if time itself was about to split in two. After the Last Supper, Jesus led his disciples out of Jerusalem, traversing the narrow, silent streets of the city to the foot of the Mount of Olives. They walked at a slow pace, and the tension was palpable in the group. The destination was the Garden of Gethsemane, a place Jesus knew well. He often went there to meditate and pray, a refuge away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The garden was surrounded by ancient olive trees, their shadows casting distorted silhouettes under the dim light of the moon. The smell of the earth mingled with the aroma of the leaves, and the wind blew gently, swaying the branches as if whispering secrets of the night. But that night, something was different. There was a restlessness in Jesus' eyes. His disciples, exhausted from dinner and long conversations about the uncertain future, followed him in silence. They had shared bread and wine, heard mysterious words about betrayal and suffering, but could not fully grasp the weight of the moment. When they arrived at the garden, Jesus stopped and looked at each of them. His voice, always calm, now carried a more serious tone. "Sit here while I go over there to pray." The disciples obeyed, sinking among the roots of the olive trees, feeling fatigue take hold of them. Peter, James, and John, the closest, were taken by Jesus a little further ahead. There was a shadow of concern on their faces. They often saw their master in prayer, but they had never seen him like this. Jesus stopped, took a deep breath, and looked up at the dark sky. The weight of what was about to happen fell upon him like a crushing rock. He knew his time had come. Turning to the three disciples, he murmured, almost in a whisper, "My soul is deeply troubled, even to death. Stay here and watch with me." Peter tried to respond, but words failed him. James and John merely nodded, feeling an anguish they could not explain. They had seen Jesus calm storms, heal the sick, and cast out demons. But now, before them, was a man carrying an invisible burden, a pain that no one else could bear. Jesus stepped away a few more paces, and finally fell to his knees. The cold ground of Gethsemane embraced his body as his hands clenched tightly in the damp earth. His chest rose and fell rapidly. Fear, pain, and loneliness surrounded him. He was facing the most difficult moment of his life. In the silence of the night, only one plea echoed among the trees: "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. But not as I will, but as you will." The darkness of Gethsemane witnessed a man struggle against his fate. But on the horizon, the flames of torches were already visible, approaching. The traitor was on his way. And with him, the Roman Empire. A pale moon hung high in the sky, casting a faint glow over the Garden of Gethsemane. The silence of the night was interrupted only by the whispering of the wind through the olive leaves and the muffled sound of Jesus' breathing. He had moved away from the disciples, who, despite being warned to stay awake, were beginning to succumb to fatigue. They did not comprehend the weight of that moment. But Jesus did. Alone, he fell to his knees on the cold, damp ground. His body trembled, not from the chill of the night, but from the overwhelming anguish that consumed his soul. The weight of destiny loomed over him like a dense shadow, an impossible burden to bear. He knew what was to come. He took a deep breath and lifted his eyes to heaven, whispering amidst the pain, "Father, if possible, let this cup pass from me." His voice broke at the end of the phrase. The plea was not a request for escape, but a genuine expression of his humanity. He knew he would face pain, humiliation, and death. But above all, he knew he would bear the weight of humanity's sins. Sweat began to trickle down his face, mingling with the silent tears that fell. His heart raced, and his breathing became increasingly difficult. He pressed his hands against the ground, fingers digging into the earth, as if seeking an anchor for his distress. "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." These were words of surrender. The internal struggle was immense, but he chose to submit to the Father's plan. The tension in his body was so extreme that something rare began to happen. From his skin, not only sweat flowed, but drops of blood. The anguish was so profound that the capillaries beneath his skin began to rupture. It was a phenomenon known as hematidrosis, something rare, but recorded in situations of extreme fear and unbearable stress. Jesus' body reacted to the overwhelming weight of the responsibility he bore. No human being had ever experienced anything like it. And yet, he remained there, praying, suffering, surrendering. After a while, staggering, he rose and returned to where Peter, James, and John were. But, to his sorrow, he found them sleeping. His closest friends, those who vowed to follow him to the end, had succumbed to fatigue. "Could you not watch with me for 1 hour?" His voice carried pain, but also understanding. The disciples awoke startled, rubbing their eyes, not fully grasping what was happening. The weight of the night still enveloped them. Jesus sighed and moved away again to pray once more. The same plea echoed in the silence, "Father, if it is not possible for this cup to pass without my drinking it, may your will be done." The fear was still there, but now something within him was strengthening. He knew the end was near. Upon returning again, he found the disciples asleep once more. They could not bear the tension of that moment. Jesus did not wake them this time. He simply stood there for a moment, watching them. They did not know what awaited them in the coming hours. Jesus closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and returned for the third and final prayer. It was the moment to fully accept the path that lay before him. His destiny was sealed. In the distance, the silence was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps and the glow of torches cutting through the darkness. The garden, once tranquil, began to be filled with moving shadows. Time had run out. Jesus opened his eyes. They had arrived. The night enveloped the Garden of Gethsemane in a heavy silence, broken only by the murmuring of Jesus' prayer. His body was consumed by anguish. The weight of his mission was not only spiritual, but also physical. As he cried out to the Father, something rare and astonishing began to happen. His sweat mixed with blood, running down his face and dripping onto the cold ground. What Jesus was experiencing was a real, rare phenomenon documented in medicine, hematidrosis. This condition occurs when a person undergoes extreme psychological stress. The nervous system, in a state of maximum alert, releases a wave of stress hormones that directly affect the capillaries supplying the sweat glands. What happens then is that these capillaries rupture due to intense pressure, mixing blood with sweat. The reddish drops that flowed down Jesus' face were a physical manifestation of the torment he was enduring internally. His body was reacting to the weight of the decision he had just made. In medicine, reports of hematidrosis are rare, but they have been observed in soldiers before battles, prisoners condemned to death, and even in people subjected to severe psychological torture. However, none of these experiences compare to the suffering that Jesus bore. It was not just fear of physical pain. He was facing something much greater, the burden of the sin of all humanity. This phenomenon, besides its physical impact, carries a profound symbolism. Jesus' sweat of blood represents the apex of his emotional and spiritual suffering. There, in Gethsemane, he felt the weight of every mistake, every pain, every injustice committed by humanity. The blood that began to be shed there was the first sign of the sacrifice that would be consummated a few hours later. Even before the Romans whipped him and before the nails pierced his hands and feet, Jesus' body was already showing signs of the intensity of his surrender. In the Old Testament, sweat was associated with human effort. In the book of Genesis, after Adam's sin, God said, "In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground," Genesis 3 verse 19. Now, in Gethsemane, Jesus was sweating not just ordinary sweat, but blood, symbolizing that he was taking upon himself the curse of humanity. The suffering that began there was not just physical, but an anguish that no other person would be able to bear. The drops of blood fell to the ground, soaking the soil. The same ground that supported the feet of his disciples now received the first shedding of the blood of the one who was about to be delivered. It was a prelude to what was to come. The decision was made. Jesus opened his eyes. He would not flee. He would not try to escape. His destiny was sealed. And, in the distance, amidst the darkness of the garden, the lights of the torches began to appear. Betrayal was on its way. The Garden of Gethsemane remained shrouded in twilight, with only the moon and stars casting a faint light over the olive trees. The air was cool yet heavy with tension. Jesus, kneeling a few meters away from his disciples, was engulfed in deep agony, sweating blood as he cried out to the Father. But the disciples slept. Peter, James, and John were nearby, but their heads felt heavy, their eyes closing against their will. The dinner, the wine of the Last Supper, and the emotional strain of the past days contributed to their inevitable sleep. They had been warned by Jesus to watch and pray, but they succumbed to fatigue. After his first anguished prayer, Jesus rose, his face still marked by the sweat of blood. He walked over to where the disciples were and, to his sorrow, found them sleeping. "Simon, are you sleeping?" he asked Peter, his voice laden with sorrow. "Could you not watch for 1 hour?" Peter awoke, still confused, blinking repeatedly to shake off the drowsiness. James and John were also trying to compose themselves. "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Those words carried a weight greater than they understood at the moment. Danger was near. The greatest spiritual battle in history was being fought. They could not stay awake. Jesus sighed deeply. He understood human weakness, but the loneliness of the moment began to intensify. His closest friends could not support him in this hour of agony. Jesus returned to his place of prayer. His soul was even more distressed, and he again poured out his supplications to the Father. "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." The silence of the garden was broken only by his breathing. Time seemed to drag slowly as he completely surrendered his life to the divine purpose. Then, rising once more, Jesus returned to the disciples. And once again, they were sleeping. This time, he did not even try to wake them. His eyes rested on those 3 men who had promised to follow him to the end, but who were now defenseless against their own fatigue. The image was painful, they wanted to stay awake, but were unable. This moment demonstrated humanity's weakness. Jesus' loneliness became even more evident. He was facing the greatest decision in history, and there was no one to support him. For the 3rd time, Jesus withdrew and prayed. His heart was already set. He had fully accepted the cross that awaited him. When he returned again, he found the disciples asleep once more. Now, they were sleeping deeply, oblivious to the critical moment unfolding around them. Jesus looked at them with compassion. They were ordinary men, fragile, made of flesh and bone. Then, for the last time, he woke them. But this time, his words were different. Are you still sleeping and resting? The hour has come. The Son of Man is being delivered into the hands of sinners. He lifted his gaze, and in the distance, torches were approaching. The sound of footsteps on the ground echoed among the trees. Betrayal was underway. The dark tranquility of the Garden of Gethsemane was shattered by a growing noise of footsteps and murmurs. The flickering glow of torches cut through the darkness, revealing an armed group approaching rapidly. At the front of the troop, a familiar figure led the group, Judas Iscariot. The disciples awoke dazed, their eyes still heavy with sleep. When they realized what was happening, panic took hold of them. Temple soldiers, Pharisees, and Roman guards were arriving, armed with swords and spears. Peter's heart raced. He exchanged quick glances with the other disciples. Why was Judas there? Why was he leading those men? But Jesus, with a serene gaze, remained steadfast. He already knew. Judas walked hurriedly, his steps firm, but his face was laden with tension. He was about to consummate the act that would mark him forever. The metallic sound of swords being drawn echoed through the garden. The soldiers were ready to act at any sign of resistance. But what would break the silence of the moment would not be a scream, nor a military order. It would be a kiss. Judas approached Jesus and, without hesitation, fulfilled the agreement with the priests. He kissed him on the cheek. Jesus looked directly into the eyes of his disciple. His voice was calm, but laden with meaning. Judas, with a kiss do you betray the Son of Man? Judas did not respond. His eyes fled from Jesus' gaze. It was too late for regrets. The soldiers, seeing the agreed signal, advanced. They moved like predators ready to capture their prey. Peter, filled with rage, drew his sword and charged at one of the men. The gleam of the blade sliced through the air and struck Malchus, the servant of the high priest, severing his ear. Malchus fell to the ground, holding the side of his face, his scream of pain echoing through the garden. Chaos ensued. But then Jesus raised his hand. Stop! His voice rang out strong, cutting through the tension. He looked at Peter and said, "Put your sword away. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword." Peter, panting, hesitated. His instinct was to fight, but Jesus' command was clear. Then, in an unexpected and shocking gesture to the soldiers, Jesus approached Malchus. Even being his enemy, even about to be taken as a prisoner, he touched the man's wound. And at the moment his hand touched the blooded skin, Malchus's ear was restored. The guards exchanged looks of disbelief. What kind of man was this? But there was no time for reflection. They had a mission to fulfill. Jesus turned to the soldiers and said, "You have come to arrest me with swords and clubs, as if I were a bandit. Every day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this is your hour, and the power of darkness." The soldiers hesitated for a moment, as if they could not believe he would not offer resistance. But then, they bound his hands, and took him as a prisoner. The disciples, filled with fear, fled. The betrayal was complete. The lamb was delivered to the wolves. Jesus was betrayed with a kiss, arrested without resistance, and abandoned by his own disciples. But that was just the beginning. What will happen now that he is in the hands of the religious leaders and the powerful Roman Empire? How will Pontius Pilate react to the accusations? And what will be Judas's fate after his betrayal? In the next video, you will witness the interrogations, the humiliations, and the twists that will lead Jesus to the most unjust trial in history. The story is not over yet. Click on the next video and discover what happens after the betrayal in Gethsemane. As soon as Judas concludes his act of betrayal, the temple guards and Roman soldiers advance to arrest Jesus. The cold and silent night of Gethsemane is suddenly broken the shouts of orders from the officers, and the snap of ropes being tied around Jesus' wrists. The disciples, until then confused and stunned, find themselves faced with the brutal reality: their master is being captured. Peter, filled with impulse, draws his sword and charges into the attack. In an impulsive gesture of defense, Peter strikes at Malchus, the servant of the high priest. The edge of the blade meets his flesh, cutting off his ear. Malchus screams in pain, bringing his hand to the blooded side of his face. Panic ensues. The soldiers prepare to retaliate. But then, before any greater conflict can occur, Jesus intervenes. He looks at Peter and says, firmly and serenely, "Put away your sword. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword." Peter, panting and confused, sheathes his blade. Jesus then approaches Malchus, who is still groaning in pain. With a simple touch, the wounded ear is restored. The miracle silences even the soldiers. What kind of prisoner heals one of his tormentors? Jesus does not resist. The soldiers and temple guards bind him, tying his hands with rough ropes. He is led out of the garden, illuminated only by the flickering glow of torches. The disciples, filled with fear, hesitate. If they stay, they may be arrested too. If they fight, they may be killed. And so, one by one, they flee. As Jesus is dragged down the dark path, Judas stands still, motionless. He watches the guards take his master away. He feels the weight of the silver coins in his pouch. Regret begins to take shape. But now, there is no turning back. Jesus' journey is just beginning. He will first be taken to the house of Annas, the former high priest. From there, he will be transferred to trial before Caiaphas, and then face the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. The betrayals, humiliations, and injustices are yet to come. And Judas, will he bear the guilt? Malcho's blood was running down his face, his scream of pain echoing through the garden. The guards instinctively stepped back, preparing to retaliate. Pedro's attack could have been the spark for a deadly confrontation. The Roman soldiers and the temple guards had witnessed rebellions before. One wrong move, and everyone there could be massacred. But before chaos could ensue, Jesus stepped forward. With a serene look, he raised his hand and commanded, "Enough." Pedro, still panting, felt his hands tremble on the hilt of the sword. He wanted to fight. But Jesus did not want that. The master then turned to Malcho, who was still pressing his hand against his bloody ear. With compassion, Jesus approached. The soldiers watched with suspicion, but did not prevent his action. Why would a prisoner be helping one of his tormentors? Then, before everyone, Jesus touched Malcho's wound. In an instant, the pain disappeared. The cut flesh was restored. The blood stopped flowing. Malcho's eyes widened. He touched the side of his head, dazed. His ear was intact. The silence that followed was overwhelming. The soldiers exchanged glances. Some looked hesitant. They had been sent to arrest a criminal. But now they were witnessing a miracle before their eyes. But orders were orders. Jesus turned to Pedro, still holding his sword. "Put your sword away. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword." Pedro, panting, did not know how to respond. His instinct was to protect his master, but Jesus was not fighting against his arrest. And then, Jesus continued, "Do you not think that I could ask the Father, and he would send 12 legions of angels to deliver me?" That statement struck the disciples like a shock. 12 legions of angels? If each Roman legion had about 6,000 soldiers, that meant Jesus could summon more than 72,000 angels to destroy that human army. But he did not. And, looking at the soldiers holding the ropes to bind him, Jesus added, "But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled, that say it must happen this way?" It was a choice. Jesus was willingly surrendering. Pedro dropped the sword, defeated by the truth. The guards then advanced and tightly bound Jesus, pulling his hands behind his back. It was at that moment that panic took hold of the disciples. If they arrested Jesus, what would they do with them? John looked around, searching for a plan. James stepped back. Andrew hesitated. But it was Peter who took the first step back. And then, like falling dominoes, they all fled. Some got lost among the trees of the garden, others ran desperately through the dark streets of Jerusalem. The master was alone. He knew this would happen. Yet still, the pain of loneliness pierced him. The soldiers dragged him along the dirt path, while the torches illuminated the beginning of his journey to trial. As the guards led Jesus out of Gethsemane, Judas stood still. He saw everything happen. The kiss, Jesus' gaze, Peter's sword, Malcho's healing. He saw Jesus being taken away, and something inside him began to shatter. The glimmer of the silver coins in his bag no longer brought satisfaction. His plan had worked. But then why did his heart weigh like a stone? The guards marched, leading Jesus through the dark streets of Jerusalem. The walk to Jesus' trial had begun. He would first be taken to the former high priest Annas, then to the high priest Caiaphas, and finally face the cruelest trial in history before Pontius Pilate. But as Jesus walks toward his destiny, Judas Iscariot begins to face the consequences of his betrayal. Will he bear the guilt? And the disciples? Will any of them return to help their master? The Roman Empire is already involved in this process, and the politics between Jews and Romans will be decisive for Jesus' fate. The city was shrouded in the twilight of dawn. The torches flickered along the stone alleys, casting dancing shadows against the walls of the houses. The Roman soldiers and the temple guards marched alongside Jesus, leading him through the streets of Jerusalem. The footsteps echoed in the silence of the night. For the temple guards, this was just another arrest. For the Roman soldiers, he was just another prisoner among many. But for Jesus, this was the walk that would determine the fate of humanity. As he walked, the weight of the ropes tightened around his wrists, but it was insignificant compared to the weight of the mission he bore. The unusual movement stirred some residents who peeked through windows and ajar doors. "Who is this prisoner?" they whispered. "It's Jesus of Nazareth." Someone replied, "The master who healed the sick? The one who multiplied loaves and fish?" Yes. Judas, one of his disciples, betrayed him. The murmurs grew louder. Some felt compassion, others disdain. Among the Pharisees and religious leaders, there was satisfaction. They had finally captured the man who challenged their authority. But among the poor and sick who had been healed by him, fear grew. The group arrived at the first point of the long night of trials, the house of Annas, the former high priest. Annas no longer held the official position, but his influence was still strong within the Sanhedrin. He was a powerful, cunning, and strategic man. The guards brought Jesus to him, and Annas observed him with a cold gaze. "So, you are the man who has caused so much turmoil in Jerusalem?" he said with disdain. Jesus remained silent. His silence was not fear. It was a silence filled with purpose. Annas grew irritated with the lack of response. "Speak. What do you teach your followers? What power do you claim to have?" Jesus lifted his gaze and, with serenity, replied, "I have always spoken openly to the world. I taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews gather. I said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I told them. They know what I said." His answer was clear. He hid nothing. His message had always been public. But the leaders did not want the truth. They wanted a justification to condemn him. Jesus' response disturbed one of the guards, who stepped forward and slapped his face hard. The dry sound of the aggression echoed through the hall. "Is this how you answer the high priest?" the guard said angrily. Jesus turned his face slowly, feeling the sting of the blow. But there was no hatred in his gaze. Only compassion. "If I spoke wrongly, tell me what it was. But if I spoke the truth, why do you strike me?" Jesus' response created discomfort in the atmosphere. Even some guards holding him avoided looking directly at him. It was as if, at that moment, they realized they were not facing an ordinary criminal. But Annas did not care. He wanted Jesus to be taken to someone with real power to condemn him. Take him to Caiaphas. And so, Jesus' walk continued. The night was still far from over. Jesus would be taken to the high priest Caiaphas, where he would face a trial full of contradictions and false testimonies. Meanwhile, Peter, who had sworn never to abandon him, would face his own trial. The moment was chaotic. The torches swayed with the movement of the soldiers, casting distorted shadows on the olive trees. The sound of swords and the guards' orders mixed with the cries of the disciples. Peter still held the sword tightly, his breath quickening. He looked around and realized the reality: they were surrounded. "Get them too," one of the soldiers ordered. It was enough to trigger a primitive instinct in the disciples. The urge to flee dominated their bodies. James ran first, followed by John. Andrew stumbled over a root, hurriedly got up, and disappeared among the trees. Matthew, the former tax collector, felt the fear of the past return. He saw a soldier approaching and dashed in the opposite direction, vanishing into the darkness. "No! Don't leave him!" Peter shouted, but his voice was lost in the confusion. Peter himself hesitated. He didn't want to flee. He wanted to fight. But looking at Jesus, he saw that the Master was not resisting. He was surrendering peacefully. Peter took a step back. Then another. And in a moment of hesitation, he turned and ran away. The last thing he saw before disappearing into the shadows was Jesus standing, serene, looking at him as if he already knew what would happen. Judas's mind was in conflict. He had betrayed his master, but nothing was going as he had imagined. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he murmured to himself. Judas had hoped that Jesus would defend himself, that he would use his power to escape, that something extraordinary would happen. But none of that occurred. The soldiers dragged him like any common criminal. The shine of the silver coins weighed in his bag, but weighed even more on his conscience. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push away the remorse. He could not turn back now. And then, Judas disappeared into the darkness of the night, carrying a regret that would soon become unbearable. The Roman guards knew that chaos could erupt if the population discovered Jesus' arrest. Haste was essential. They bound him and quickly took him out of Gethsemane. The night was silent, but Jesus' fate was already sealed. The city slept, unaware that when the sun rose, it would witness the darkest day in history. Jesus would first be taken to the high priest Caiaphas, where he would face a trial full of false accusations. Meanwhile, Peter would face the most challenging moment of his faith. Would he maintain his loyalty or deny the Master in the face of danger? The soldiers bound Jesus with thick ropes, tightening them around his wrists to the point of burning his skin. He does not resist. He does not scream. He does not fight. He simply walks, accepting the fate he already knew. The path through the streets of Jerusalem is grim. The city sleeps, but curious eyes peek from the shadows. Some awake residents watch the small troop advancing through the stone alleys, whispering among themselves. Is that man the prophet from Galilee? Where are they taking him? The news of the arrest begins to spread, but no one dares to intervene. The fear of the Roman soldiers and the religious leaders is greater. The disciples had vanished. Peter, however, followed at a distance, hiding in the shadows. His heart raced. He did not know what he would do, he only knew he could not abandon him completely. The guards lead Jesus first to Annas, the former high priest who, even without an official position, still wielded strong political and religious influence. The door of the house opens. The light of lanterns flickers in the darkness. Jesus is pushed inside. His first trial would begin now. Annas sat in a high chair, his face illuminated by the fire of the lantern. His small, shrewd eyes coldly analyze Jesus. "So, you are the master who has caused so much commotion?" His voice sounds heavy with disdain. Jesus does not respond. His silence is a blow stronger than any word. The guards push Jesus closer. Annas crosses his arms and tries to press him. "I have heard that you teach the people in synagogues and marketplaces. What doctrine is this? Who gave you this authority?" Jesus slowly lifts his eyes and calmly replies, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews gather. I have said nothing in secret." Annas narrows his eyes. The answer was true, but it was not what he wanted to hear. One of the guards, irritated by Jesus' boldness, slaps him hard across the face. The sound echoes through the room. "Is this how you answer the high priest?" Jesus stands firm, showing no pain. He simply says, "If I have spoken wrongly, prove it. But if I spoke the truth, why do you strike me?" Annas realizes he will get nowhere here. Jesus would not yield to provocations. With a wave, he orders that Jesus be taken to Caiaphas, the current high priest and leader of the Sanhedrin. The soldiers roughly pull Jesus. He would now face an illegal trial, orchestrated during the night to ensure his condemnation. Outside, Peter watches everything from afar. He is scared, but something inside him prevents him from fleeing completely. Seeing the guards take Jesus to Caiaphas' house, he discreetly approaches. "Hey!" A servant of the high priest recognizes him. "Aren't you one of his disciples?" Peter's blood runs cold. His heart races. He feels the gaze of several people turning towards him. And then, without thinking, the words escape his mouth with me. "No, I am not." The first denial occurs. But soon, others would follow. Meanwhile, Jesus faces his second hearing, an unjust trial, where the verdict had already been decided before it even began. Jesus will face false accusations in the Sanhedrin, while Peter will face his greatest test of faith. Will Peter hold on to his courage, or will his weakness cause him to deny the Master 3 times? And Jesus? Will he find any justice before the religious leaders, or will he be condemned before dawn? The story is still far from over. Don't miss the next chapter of this journey that changed the world forever. Under the flickering light of the torches, Anna's house stands imposing in the darkness. The guards push Jesus inside, his wrists still bound with rough ropes. In the main hall, Annas, an elderly man with a severe gaze and calculating expression, awaits. He clasps his hands before his chest, analyzing Jesus for a long moment before speaking. "They have brought me the famous preacher from Galilee. At last we meet, Jesus of Nazareth. They say you have spoken against the temple and that you deceive the people with dangerous doctrines. What do you have to say?" Jesus remains silent, his eyes fixed on Annas. An impatient guard pulls Jesus by the shoulders. The high priest asks a question. "Answer!" Jesus raises his gaze and, with a serene voice, replies, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews gather. I said nothing in secret. Ask those who heard me, they know what I taught." The answer displeases one of the guards, who strikes Jesus in the face with the back of his hand. "Is this how you respond to the high priest?" Jesus does not react with anger. He simply observes him. If I spoke wrongly, prove the wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why do you strike me? Annas furrows his brow. This man does not bend before authority, and that unsettles him. But he also realizes that there is not enough legal basis to condemn him. Take him to Caiaphas. He will know what to do. The guards pull Jesus back into the cold night, heading towards an even more hostile trial. Under the flickering light of the torches, Anna's house stands imposing in the darkness. The guards push Jesus inside, his wrists still bound with rough ropes. In the main hall, Annas, an elderly man with a stern gaze and calculating expression, awaits. He clasps his hands before his chest, analyzing Jesus for a long moment before speaking. They have brought me the famous preacher from Galilee. At last, we meet, Jesus of Nazareth. They say you have spoken against the temple and that you deceive the people with dangerous doctrines. What do you have to say? Jesus remains silent, his eyes fixed on Annas. An impatient guard pulls Jesus by the shoulders. The high priest asks a question. Answer! Jesus raises his gaze and, with a serene voice, replies, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews gather. I said nothing in secret. Ask those who heard me, they know what I taught. The answer displeases one of the guards, who strikes Jesus in the face with the back of his hand. Is this how you respond to the high priest? Jesus does not react with anger. He simply observes him. If I spoke wrongly, prove the wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why do you strike me? Annas furrows his brow. This man does not bend before authority, and that bothers him. But he also realizes that there is not enough legal basis to condemn him. Take him to Caiaphas. He will know what to do. The guards pull Jesus back into the cold night, heading towards an even more hostile trial. The grand hall of the Sanhedrin is illuminated by flickering torches, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The space is dominated by figures dressed in heavy robes, Pharisees and Sadducees occupying their semicircular seats. The urgency to condemn Jesus is evident in the very fact that they are gathered there at that moment. Trials were not supposed to happen at night, as Jewish law dictated that such serious decisions be made in the light of day. But this was not an ordinary night. The desire to eliminate the man who challenged religious authority was greater than any rule. Jesus stands in the center, hands bound, his face marked by fatigue and the blow he received from a guard during the previous interrogation. His gaze is not one of fear, but of unwavering calm, something that deeply unsettles those present. Caiaphas, the high priest, stands at the front, with a stern yet restless look. He needs to find a strong enough accusation to justify Jesus' condemnation. Present the witnesses. At this command, two men appear. Their looks are anxious, insecure. They were hastily recruited and, although trained to lie, their words lack coherence. I heard him say he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. No, he said he would destroy the temple and it would never be rebuilt. The members of the Sanhedrin exchange glances. What they expected to be a condemning testimony turns into a problem. The statements do not match. If they want to condemn him, they will need something stronger. Caiaphas tightens his fingers against the arm of his chair. Time is running out, and the trial needs a twist. Do you have nothing to say in response to these accusations? Jesus remains silent. He does not defend himself, does not respond to the false witnesses, only maintains his firm stance. This silence weighs like a rock on the shoulders of those present. There is no fear, no despair in his expression, only a deep gaze that seems to pierce the soul of each person there. Caiaphas' frustration turns into impatience. He needs an answer, something that can turn the tide. Then, He asks the decisive question, the one that could lead to the final condemnation. Tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of the blessed God? Everyone in the room holds their breath. There is no escaping now. If Jesus confirms he is the Messiah, they can accuse him of blasphemy. The silence stretches into a moment that feels like eternity. Then, finally, Jesus lifts his head and replies, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Almighty and coming on the clouds of heaven. The answer echoes through the room. Some present widen their eyes, others exchange looks of surprise and indignation. But Caiaphas reacts theatrically. He suddenly stands up, tears his robes, and shouts, blasphemy! We do not need more witnesses. The Sanhedrin erupts in murmurs and exclamations. Some agree, others seem hesitant, but the majority has already made their decision. He must die. Yes. He claims to be equal to God. The trial has been a farce from the beginning, but now the verdict is given. Jesus will be taken to Pilate, for only Rome has the power to decree the death penalty. The guards advance on him, pulling him roughly. As Jesus is led out, some of the priests smile, satisfied that they have achieved what they wanted. But little do they know that this condemnation will not be the end, it will be the beginning of the greatest act of redemption in history. The room of the Sanhedrin was buzzing with murmurs and indignant glances. The elders, scribes, and priests who made up the council were gathered for what would be the most controversial trial in the history of Israel. The thick air of expectation and tension made it difficult to even breathe. Caiaphas, the high priest, was still standing, his face marked by a look of feigned outrage. The silence that had settled after Jesus' response was broken by his dramatic gesture. With a swift movement, he tore his robes. This was an act of extreme symbolism, something a high priest would only do in a moment of great religious indignation. He has blasphemed. He dared to equate himself with God. The other members of the Sanhedrin exchanged glances. Some looked surprised, others satisfied. It was exactly the accusation they needed. According to Mosaic law, blasphemy was a crime punishable by death. What need do we have for witnesses? You yourselves have heard. What is your verdict? Murmurs erupted throughout the room. Men raised their fists, some pounded the table, others looked at Jesus with open hatred. He must die. Yes. He claims to be the Son of God. This man is a threat to our faith. The voices grew louder until, by acclamation, they decided Jesus should be condemned to death. But there was a problem. Although they had power over religious matters and could determine punishments within Jewish law, they were under the dominion of the Roman Empire. Only Rome could decree and carry out a death sentence. We cannot kill him. Roman law prevents us. Caiaphas knew this. To ensure that Jesus was truly killed, they would need to take him to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. However, the Romans did not care about blasphemy or Jewish laws. They needed a political accusation, something that would make Pilate see Jesus as a threat to the empire. It was then that the Jewish leaders decided to change the narrative. They would not take Jesus to Pilate as a blasphemer. They would accuse him of something much more serious in the eyes of the Romans, rebellion and treason against Caesar. We will say that he proclaims himself King of the Jews. We will say that he threatens Caesar and incites the people to revolt. The eyes of those present sparkled. This, indeed, could make Pilate act. Accusing him of being a revolutionary leader was the most effective way to ensure his execution. But he didn't say that. Caiaphas turned slowly, giving him a cutting look. It doesn't matter. The Sanhedrin was determined. With the death sentence already decreed, the guards approached Jesus. One of them untied his hands and violently shoved him. Then the insults and assaults began. Those men, who should have been the guardians of faith, became executioners. If you are a prophet, Tell us who struck you." A punch hit Jesus' face, throwing him to the side. Laughter filled the hall. Another blow came, this time from a club. "Where is your power now, Messiah?" Jesus remained silent. His eyes, despite the growing swelling, remained serene. He knew this was his mission. He would not resist. Finally, at dawn, the Jewish leaders led Jesus, bound, to the fortress where Pontius Pilate resided. They knew that the final battle for his condemnation would begin there. The night was already dissolving into a timid dawn when Peter found himself hidden among the shadows of the high priest's courtyard. His heart was still racing. He had followed Jesus from a distance, fearing being identified, yet unable to abandon him completely. Now, there he was, mingling with the servants and guards of the Sanhedrin, trying to go unnoticed while the trial unfolded inside Caiaphas' residence. The courtyard was illuminated by a few torches, and a charcoal brazier burned in the center. Several men tried to warm themselves against the morning chill. Peter pulled his cloak tighter around him, trying to hide his face, but his presence would not go unnoticed for long. It was then that a young servant of the high priest recognized him. "You were with that Jesus, the Galilean." Peter's blood ran cold. He felt the gaze of others turn towards him. His heart hammered in his chest. "I don't know what you're talking about." He stood up hastily, moving away from the brazier. He walked towards the entrance of the courtyard, hoping to hide better in the darkness. But it was no use. Another person saw him and pointed him out to the others. This man was also with Jesus of Nazareth. Peter felt cold sweat trickle down his neck. Fear took hold of him. If he admitted to knowing Jesus, he could be arrested too. They could beat him. Perhaps even kill him. "I swear I don't know him." The group around the fire began to murmur. The eyes on Peter were inquisitive, suspicious. He tried to move away again, but a third man grabbed him by the arm. "Wait! I recognize your accent. You're from Galilee. You're one of his disciples." This time, Peter was in complete panic. Everyone was now watching him with suspicion. The fear of being arrested, of being dragged into that house where Jesus was being judged, was greater than any loyalty. "I don't know this man. I swear to God." And then, the moment the words left his mouth, the piercing sound of a rooster crowing echoed. Peter froze. The sound tore at his soul. He remembered. Just a few hours earlier, during the Last Supper, Jesus had looked at him with eyes of infinite compassion and said, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." The weight of betrayal fell upon Peter like an avalanche. His chest tightened, his breath became ragged. He looked around, but everything seemed to spin. The world was crumbling around him. And then, amidst the crowd, he saw Jesus being led away by guards. Jesus turned and looked directly at him. There was no hatred. There was no condemnation. Just sadness. Peter couldn't bear it. With tears in his eyes, he turned away from the courtyard and fled into the darkness of the city. When he finally stopped, far from everyone, he fell to his knees on the cold ground of Jerusalem and wept bitterly. His heart was broken. He had failed. He had promised that he would never abandon Jesus, that he would never deny him. But when put to the test, he succumbed to fear. Regret consumed him. He didn't know what he would do now. What could he do? Peter, who had so often declared himself willing to die for Jesus, now saw himself as the most miserable of men. The city of Jerusalem began to awaken. The sky, tinged with the first rays of a pale sun, cast long shadows across the narrow, dusty streets. The air was still cold, but the movement in the alleys indicated that a new day was beginning, a day that would forever be marked in history. In the high priest's palace, Caiaphas and the elders of the Sanhedrin were already up, eager to finalize what they had started during the night. The sentence had been given: Jesus was guilty of blasphemy and should die. But there was a problem. The Sanhedrin did not have the authority to impose the death penalty. That power belonged solely to the Romans. For their sentence to be executed, they needed the approval of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. The Jewish leaders, accompanied by a group of guards and temple soldiers, led Jesus through the streets of the city. His face was marked by blows, his eyes carried the weight of a sleepless night, but he walked in silence. His dignity contrasted with the fury of his accusers. As they passed through the market, some people began to gather. Whispers ran through the crowd. Some looked on with disdain, believing he truly was a blasphemer. Others, however, saw his state and felt a lump in their throats. The one who days before had been hailed with branches and songs now walked shackled like any common criminal. Peter, who still hid in the shadows, watched from afar. His eyes were red from weeping. He wanted to scream, wanted to do something, but he had no strength. The weight of his betrayal crushed him. Judas also wandered the streets, tormented. He had learned that Jesus had been condemned, and now it was too late to turn back. His silver coin seemed to burn in his hands. He wanted to undo what he had done, but there was no escape. Pilate's praetorium was located in the Antonia fortress, an imposing Roman barracks that dominated the landscape of Jerusalem. It was a symbol of imperial power and foreign occupation, a constant reminder that the Jews were under Roman rule. The religious leaders stopped before the entrance, but did not dare cross the threshold. It was the eve of Passover, and according to their laws, entering the residence of a Gentile would render them unclean, preventing them from participating in the rituals. "Go tell Pilate we have an urgent case for him." The soldier obeyed, disappearing into the interior of the praetorium. A few minutes later, Pilate appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing his official toga. He was a man with a cold expression, accustomed to dealing with rebellions and conflicts. His gaze swept over the crowd until it fixed on the prisoner they brought him. "What do you want from me so early?" "We have brought this man. He is a dangerous criminal and must be condemned to death." Pilate raised an eyebrow. He had heard of this Jesus. He knew he was not a violent leader, but rather a preacher. His name had been mentioned a few times among the reports of the city. The governor sensed that something was amiss. "If he is a criminal, judge him according to your laws. We have already judged him, and he is guilty. But we do not have permission to execute anyone. Only Rome can do that." Pilate sighed. It was clear to him that these men did not want justice, but rather to rid themselves of a problem. He looked again at Jesus. The prisoner was not terrified, did not plead for his life. He simply stared back with a serene gaze, as if he were there by his own choice. The governor took a deep breath. He knew that the decision he would make that day could change the course of events. And so, with the fate of a man in his hands and the weight of politics on his shoulders, Pilate ordered that Jesus be taken for interrogation. The sun was high in the sky when Pilate, governor of Judea, found himself at an impasse. Before him stood Jesus, a serene man with a deep gaze, who showed no signs of fear or despair. On the other side, the religious leaders, impatient, pressed for a condemnation. The courtyard of the praetorium was crowded. Priests, elders, and scribes were huddled together, murmuring among themselves. The atmosphere was tense. Pilate, an experienced politician, immediately sensed that this was not a simple matter of justice. Something deeper was at play. "What charges do you bring against this man?" The priests exchanged glances. They had to be careful. If they claimed that Jesus was guilty only of blasphemy against God, Pilate would not care. But if they framed the issue as a threat to the power of Rome, perhaps they could achieve the sentence they desired. This man has declared himself king of the Jews and incited the people against Caesar." Pilate raised an eyebrow. King of the Jews? That was indeed a serious accusation. If Jesus was truly claiming a throne, he could be considered a rebel, an insurgent, and Rome did not tolerate insurrections. Has he led any revolt? Gathered armies? Attacked any fortress? The priests hesitated. Jesus had never taken up arms, never instigated a rebellion against Rome. He disturbs the people with his teachings. He says we must serve God above Caesar. Pilate sighed. It was clear that these men were not concerned with Rome, but with their own religious authority. If Jesus were a real threat, the Roman soldiers would have already dealt with him. The governor looked directly at Jesus. Something about this man intrigued him. His silence, his calm. He did not seem like a criminal. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus lifted his eyes and answered, without hesitation, "Are you asking this on your own, or did others say this about me?" Pilate was taken aback by the response. Most prisoners would plead for their lives. But Jesus? He seemed in control of the situation. "Am I a Jew? Your own people and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus then spoke with impressive serenity, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my followers would have fought to prevent me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders. But now, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate pondered. This man spoke of a different kingdom, something he had never heard before. "So, you are a king? You say that I am a king. I was born and came into the world to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate frowned. Truth? What was truth, after all? He, a man accustomed to political games, knew that truth was often shaped by interests. What is truth? The silence that followed was almost palpable. The priests began to grow impatient. Pilate was hesitating. They needed to pressure him. He made himself equal to God. This is blasphemy. If you do not condemn him, you are against Caesar. The crowd began to stir. Pilate realized he was running out of options. He saw no guilt in Jesus, but he also did not want a riot in Jerusalem. And so, trying to escape this political trap, Pilate made a decision that would forever change the course of history. The courtroom of the Praetorium was immersed in a tense silence. The Roman governor Pontius Pilate observed the man before him. Jesus, serene, stood there, unchained, unafraid. Outside, priests and members of the Sanhedrin murmured, anxiously awaiting a verdict. Pilate, accustomed to judging violent criminals, did not see in Jesus a dangerous man. He had dealt with insurgents, thieves, rebels trying to challenge the power of Rome. But this prisoner was different. He did not plead, did not show fear. He was simply there, as if he had chosen this path. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus lifted his eyes and calmly replied, "Are you asking this on your own, or did others tell you this about me?" Pilate frowned. That was not the expected answer. For the first time, he felt that it was not he who was interrogating Jesus, but rather the opposite. "Am I a Jew? Your own people and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus, remaining calm, answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my being handed over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from here." Pilate took a deep breath. Once again, that answer unsettled him. He had heard many men claiming grand titles, but Jesus spoke of a kingdom that did not involve weapons, armies, or politics. "So, you are a king? You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." The governor fell silent for a moment. To bear witness to the truth. What did that mean? He, a man shaped by the pragmatism and political intrigues of Rome, had heard many versions of the truth. Pilate stepped closer and gazed into Jesus' eyes. Then, almost as if speaking to himself, he murmured, "What is truth?" The silence that followed seemed to fill the entire room. The question hung in the air, laden with a weight that transcended politics or law. Jesus did not answer. He did not need to. The truth was there, before Pilate. But the governor, wrapped in his own doubts and fears, did not perceive it. Outside, the impatient crowd began to stir. Pilate sighed. He knew that this trial was not about justice, but about religious and political interests. If he refused to condemn Jesus, he could provoke a riot. If he condemned him, he would be sacrificing an innocent man. And then, without waiting for a response, Pilate turned and left. The fate of Jesus was slowly being sealed. The morning sun was already illuminating the walls of Jerusalem when Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, stepped out of the praetorium to face the religious leaders and the restless crowd. He had already interrogated Jesus, and something inside him told him that this man was not guilty of any crime against Rome. Pilate was not a naive ruler. He had dealt with countless rebels and pretenders to the throne. Since being appointed to govern the province of Judea, he had learned that the Jewish leadership had their own internal disputes and often used Roman power to resolve their conflicts. He knew how to recognize a real threat when he saw one. But this man before him? He was not a revolutionary, he was not an armed leader, he did not incite riots. They say you declare yourself king, but your own people handed you over to me. What should I do with you? Jesus remained calm. His gaze was not one of fear, nor of challenge, but of a silent firmness. He already knew what the outcome of this trial would be. Outside, the priests were impatient. The high priest Caiaphas stepped forward. "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate sighed and rubbed his temples. He did not want to get involved in this case. "Then judge him yourselves, according to your law." The religious leaders exchanged glances. The answer was not sufficient for them. Caiaphas stepped forward again. "We do not have permission to execute anyone." That was it. They wanted Pilate to be the executioner. They wanted to use Roman authority to condemn Jesus to death. Pilate glanced at Jesus, who remained impassive, not pleading, not defending himself. The governor sighed deeply. The situation was beginning to feel like a trap. Why were these men, who so hated Roman domination, now begging for Rome to resolve the case for them? Pilate realized that Jesus was not a threat to the empire, but rather to the power and influence of those religious leaders. He crossed his arms and looked back at Caiaphas and the other members of the Sanhedrin. What, after all, is the accusation against this man? The leaders hesitated. They knew that Rome did not care about purely religious issues. So they began to shape the accusation in political terms. He declares himself the Messiah, a king. The word king caught Pilate's attention. He narrowed his eyes and turned to Jesus. If this man was indeed proclaiming himself king, then Rome would have a problem. But Jesus did not resemble any of the self-proclaimed kings Pilate had encountered before. He had no armies, he did not call the people to take up arms, he did not threaten Caesar. The governor realized that there was something more behind that accusation. He needed to find a way out. If he condemned an innocent man, his conscience would trouble him. If he acquitted Jesus, he would face the wrath of the priests and could incite a revolt among the Jews. But then, an idea occurred to him. Perhaps there was a way to escape that situation without making a definitive decision. He knew that Jesus was from Galilee, a territory governed by Herod Antipas, the tetrarch of that region. A slight smile appeared on Pilate's lips. He found his solution. Jesus is a Galilean, isn't he? The priests nodded. Then he belongs to Herod's jurisdiction. Take him to Herod Antipas. Let him decide what to do. And so, with a skillful political maneuver, Pilate tried to rid himself of the burden of that trial. But the story was far from over. The atmosphere around the praetorium grew increasingly tense. The morning sun was already shining on Jerusalem, and the crowd outside the Roman governor's palace was swelling. Governor Pontius Pilate paced back and forth, observing the priests, the leaders of the Sanhedrin, and the silent figure of Jesus, who stood without showing fear or despair. The priests were impatient. They had already taken Jesus to Herod Antipas, but the Galilean tetrarch, after mocking the prisoner and demanding miracles as proof of his identity, had sent him back to Pilate, refusing to give a verdict. Now, the Jewish leaders demanded a definitive answer from the Roman governor. "Governor, we cannot waste any more time. This man claims to be king. If you do not condemn him, you will be complicit in his rebellion against Caesar." Pilate sighed heavily. He had heard that accusation before and knew it was an attempt at manipulation. Jesus bore no resemblance to the political agitators that Rome usually executed. He did not incite the people to rebel, did not arm armies, did not directly challenge Caesar's rule. But the priests knew how to pressure him. Pilate was already in a delicate situation with Emperor Tiberius. Any revolt in Judea could mean the end of his position. He needed to act cautiously. "I have interrogated him and found no guilt in him." Herod also saw no reason to condemn him. "Why do you insist on this?" The high priest stepped forward, pointing at Jesus. "He does not deny being the Messiah, a king. If you allow him to live, you will be betraying Caesar." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Pilate realized that the situation could spiral out of control. The leaders of the Sanhedrin were inciting the people. The Roman governor looked at Jesus. The prisoner remained motionless, offering no resistance, not even attempting to justify himself. The accusation of self-proclaiming king could be dangerous. If word reached Tiberius that Pilate was ignoring a potential rebel, his position would be threatened. The issue was no longer about Jesus' guilt, but about maintaining political control. Then, Pilate had an idea. Perhaps there was a way to free Jesus without being held accountable. He turned to the priests and the people. "Today is your festival. And as usual, we release a prisoner for you. Do you want me to release Jesus, who is called the King of the Jews?" The leaders of the Sanhedrin exchanged glances. They could not allow Pilate to release Jesus. Quickly, they began to incite the crowd. "Not this man. Release Barabbas to us." The name echoed among the crowd, and the shouts intensified. Barabbas was a notorious criminal involved in revolts against Rome. He was a violent man, a murderer. But the priests were willing to prefer him over Jesus. Pilate was surprised. He looked at the people, then at Jesus. The contrast between the two prisoners was striking. "And what shall I do then with this one they call the King of the Jews?" The crowd, manipulated by the priests, began to shout in unison, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate felt a chill. He did not want to condemn Jesus, but he felt cornered. He looked at the religious leaders. They would not back down. If he refused to condemn him, they could accuse him before Caesar of being complicit with a rebel. The Roman governor sighed, stood up, and walked to a basin of water. Before everyone, he washed his hands and declared, "I am innocent of this just man's blood." "The responsibility is yours." The priests and the crowd shouted in response, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." Pilate hesitated for a moment. Then, with a wave of his hand, he sealed Jesus' fate. "Take him away. Have him flogged, and then crucify him." The trial was over. The sentence had been given. Jesus' fate was sealed. Pilate breathed deeply. He felt pressured, cornered between the demands of the Jewish leaders and his own conscience. He had repeatedly declared that he saw no guilt in Jesus, but the insistence of the priests and the Sanhedrin put him in an uncomfortable position. Then, an idea arose in his mind. Jesus was a Galilean. And, as a Galilean, he was under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas, the Tetrarch of Galilee. Coincidentally, Herod was in Jerusalem for Passover. If he sent Jesus to Herod, perhaps he could avoid making a definitive decision about the case. With a gesture, he ordered the soldiers to take the prisoner away. The priests and leaders of the Sanhedrin closely followed the movement, fearful that Pilate was trying to avoid the condemnation. This man is a Galilean. He belongs to the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. Take him to him. The Roman soldiers held Jesus firmly and dragged him through the narrow streets of Jerusalem to Herod's palace. Herod Antipas was a vain man, thirsty for spectacles. He ruled Galilee under Roman dominion and had a history of controversial decisions. He was the one who ordered the execution of John the Baptist, fearing his influence over the people. Now, upon hearing that Jesus was being brought to him, his eyes sparkled with interest. Finally! I have heard so much about this man. They say he performs miracles. Perhaps he will do one for me. When Jesus was brought before him, Herod examined him from head to toe. The prisoner was dirty, bruised, and covered in dust, but his posture was upright. There was something about him that disturbed the Tetrarch, a serene, unyielding presence. Herod rose from his throne and approached Jesus, looking him in the eyes. Are you the one they call the Messiah? The King of the Jews? They say you have the power to heal the sick, cast out demons. So why don't you perform a miracle now? Jesus remained silent. The priests, who had followed up to that point, seized the opportunity to reinforce their accusations. He corrupts the people, incites disobedience against Rome, and claims to be the Son of God. Herod ignored the accusations and continued to gaze at Jesus with curiosity. He was used to seeing men tremble before him, pleading for their lives. But this prisoner showed no fear, no despair. Jesus' silence began to irritate him. Do you have nothing to say? Defend yourself. Or are you just an impostor? Nothing. No words. Herod's courtiers and soldiers began to laugh and mock Jesus. One of the guards took a shiny robe and threw it over the prisoner's shoulders. Look! The great King of the Jews! Where is your crown? The court burst into laughter. Others began to hit Jesus, pushing him back and forth, treating him as a mere object of amusement. Herod crossed his arms and smiled. This man is nothing but a madman. I see no threat in him. After more time of mockery, Herod lost interest. He did not see Jesus as a political rebel, nor did he care about religious disputes. He decided not to get involved in the trial and, with a gesture of disdain, ordered that the prisoner be returned to Pilate. The priests were furious. They wanted Herod to make a definitive decision, but the Tetrarch ignored them. Take him back to the governor. Tell Pilate that this man is not my problem. And so, Jesus was led again through the streets of Jerusalem, dragged from one trial to another. But the final decision still lay in Pilate's hands. As the soldiers took him back to the praetorium, Jesus' fate became increasingly inevitable. This is not just a story from the past. It is an invitation for your transformation. Just as Jesus faced injustice, silence, and pain, we all go through difficult moments in our journey. But there is a greater purpose behind every challenge. Here, on our channel, we are building a community of people seeking knowledge, faith, and spiritual growth. You are not alone. Together, we can spread this message of hope and change to thousands of lives. Now, you can be part of this mission. Leave your like to show that this message matters. Subscribe to the channel and join us on this walk of faith. Share this video and help this word reach more hearts. Every click you make is a step for this truth to reach more people. Let's transform lives together and strengthen this chain of faith. Do you accept this call? The sound of footsteps echoed across the cold marble of the praetorium. The Roman guards, still with the echoes of Herod's laughter in their minds, dragged Jesus back to the governor's palace. His body already bore the marks of humiliation and the blows he had received. The makeshift purple robe had been forcibly removed, leaving his skin marked by friction. The branch they had given him as a scepter was thrown to the ground, broken. Yet his expression remained serene, as if he were immune to the weight of the circumstances. Pilate was seated in his judgment seat, his eyes weary. As soon as he saw Jesus being brought in again, he sighed, irritated. Again? As if I didn't have enough problems already. The Jewish priests approached, determined. They had gained nothing from Herod and now demanded an answer. Governor, Herod also saw that this man deserves judgment. But it is up to Rome to apply the punishment. Pilate leaned forward, analyzing Jesus once more. He had hoped Herod would resolve the issue and wash his hands of the case. But now, he found himself forced to confront the matter again. I have interrogated him before and found no crime. Herod found none either. So why do you insist? The crowd that was beginning to form around the praetorium murmured restlessly. Jews from various parts of the region were there for Passover, and the religious leaders knew they needed to keep the pressure on the governor. He declared himself king, governor. This is an affront to the empire. Pilate frowned and looked again at Jesus. The man before him, beaten, bloodied, and dressed in rags, did not seem a threat to Caesar. How could someone so humble lead a rebellion against Rome? Are you really a king? You have told me before that your kingdom is not of this world. But what kingdom is that? Jesus, with a low and firm voice, replied without hesitation, "You say so. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to bear witness to the truth." Pilate fixed his gaze on the prisoner for a moment and then let out a slight smile of irony. He leaned back, shaking his head. What is truth? Silence. The question hung in the air, but Jesus did not respond. Pilate did not expect an answer. He stood up from his seat, turned to the priests and the crowd. I find no guilt in this man. The governor's words made the square erupt in murmurs. The priests exchanged frustrated glances. They could not allow Jesus to be released. If you release him, you are not a friend of Caesar. Anyone who declares himself king opposes the emperor. The accusation was dangerous. Pilate knew that any hint of treason against Caesar could cost him his position or his life. He looked around. The murmuring of the crowd grew louder. The governor, now cornered, needed to find a way out. But deep down, he already knew that his attempt to avoid a decision was coming to an end. The sun was beginning to rise on the horizon of Jerusalem, casting its golden light over the city walls. The day promised to be one of great commotion, and the courtyard of Pilate's praetorium was becoming increasingly crowded. The murmur of voices echoed off the ancient stones as soldiers tried to contain the throng that was gathering. Pilate was restless. From the beginning, he knew that this trial was more political than legal. Jesus posed no real threat to the power of Rome, yet the priests were pressing him to condemn him. He needed to find a solution, something that would relieve him of this responsibility without causing further unrest. Then an idea occurred to him, the custom of Passover. Every year, during the Jewish festival, Rome allowed one prisoner to be released as a gesture of goodwill. Pilate saw this as a strategic escape. He would choose a detestable criminal and place the decision in the hands of the people. Surely, common sense would prevail, and Jesus would be freed. He ordered that Barabbas be brought forth. Barabbas was a well-known name. A thief, a murderer, and the leader of a violent rebellion against Rome, he had been imprisoned for serious crimes and awaited execution. When the guards pulled him out of his cell and brought him to the courtyard, the crowd reacted with expressions of shock and fear. His face was marked by scars, his clothes dirty and torn. He looked around, his dark and fierce eyes scanning the crowd. Barabbas knew his time was coming until he heard Pilate speaking. "It is your custom that I release a prisoner at Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews, or Barabbas?" The question hung in the air. Silence was quickly broken by whispers and exchanged glances. Pilate crossed his arms and waited. For a moment, he thought he had found a way out. Barabbas was a notorious criminal. Who in their right mind would choose to release such a dangerous man instead of someone who had committed no crime? But the priests, realizing the governor's strategy, began to act. They walked through the crowd, whispering in the ears of the people, inflaming them against Jesus. "He is not our Messiah. He has blasphemed. He must die. Choose Barabbas." The voices grew louder. Gradually, the popular pressure tilted in the opposite direction of what was expected. Pilate raised an eyebrow, surprised to realize that something was wrong. When he asked again, the response came like a roar. "Barabbas! Release Barabbas!" Pilate felt the blood freeze in his veins. He looked at Jesus, who remained silent, his eyes calm amidst the chaos around him. How could they choose a murderer over him? And what shall I do with this man whom you call the King of the Jews? The answer came immediately, in a cry that made even the soldiers shrink back at the ferocity of the crowd. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision he was trying to avoid. His strategy had failed. There was no easy way out anymore. The people's choice had been made. The sun was already rising over Jerusalem, casting its light upon the city walls as the tension in the Praetorium reached its peak. Pilate observed the agitated crowd before him, still trying to find a way out of the dilemma he faced. The people's choice was clear: Barabbas should be released, and Jesus condemned. But something within Pilate prevented him from simply yielding to the pressure. He knew there was no guilt in that man. As he reflected on his next decision, one of his servants hurriedly approached, carrying a small scroll. The man leaned in and extended the message with trembling hands. "Sir, this message comes from your wife. She insists that you read it immediately." Pilate frowned. Claudia Procula, his wife, rarely involved herself in his administrative matters. Why, now, in the midst of a tense trial, would she send a message with such urgency? He unrolled the scroll and read the hurried and anguished words, "Do not involve yourself with that righteous man, for today, in a dream, I suffered greatly because of him." Pilate closed his eyes for a moment. His wife was not an impressionable woman. Although she was Roman, she showed interest in the customs and beliefs of the Jews and always paid attention to rumors about prophets and messiahs. If she was alarmed enough to send a message in the midst of a trial, it was because she truly believed that Jesus was innocent. The governor felt a chill run down his spine. He already suspected that this case was beyond mere politics. Now, he began to fear that he was dealing with something much greater. He raised his eyes and stared at Jesus. The prisoner was there, in silence, with a calm gaze, showing no fear or anguish. It was as if he knew what was about to happen. "Who are you, really?" But before he could formulate a plan to distance himself from this trial without attracting the wrath of the priests, a new cry echoed from the crowd. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate looked again at the scroll. His wife's words weighed on his conscience, but the crowd was furious. He felt that he was running out of time. He needed to make a decision, and fast. The clamor of the crowd grew like an impending storm. The heavy air of dust and sweat was filled with exalted voices demanding the crucifixion of Jesus. Pilate, standing in the praetorium, observed the scene before him. His mind was in conflict. He had already tried several maneuvers to avoid this decision. He had sent Jesus to herd, offered the choice between him and Barabbas, even tried to appeal to the people's compassion, but all had been in vain. The hatred of the crowd seemed uncontrollable. He turned to the religious leaders, their faces marked by impatience and fury. Caiaphas, the high priest, stared intently at Pilate, awaiting the inevitable outcome. "Why do you insist so much? What crime has this man committed? I see no guilt in him that justifies death." The priests merely exchanged glances, with no intention of debating. Then, a shout echoed among the crowd, inflaming the spirits even more. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate looked around. The danger was imminent. The eyes of the people burned with fury and a thirst for blood. The governor knew that if he did not yield, he could face a riot. This was something that Rome would not forgive. He had already had enough problems with rebellions in Judea and knew that another riot could cost him his position and even his life. His wife, Claudia Procula, had warned him about the disturbing dream she had about Jesus. But he could not base a political decision on a portent. He was cornered between his conscience and the brutal reality of Roman politics. "If this is what you want..." He gestured to one of his servants, who brought a basin of clear water. Before the entire crowd, Pilate dipped his hands in the water and rubbed them slowly, allowing everyone to see his gesture. "I am innocent of the blood of this just man. The responsibility is yours." The crowd, becoming even more inflamed, shouted in response, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." Pilate stood still for a moment, watching those words spread like fire among the people. He knew that this decision would follow him forever, but there was nothing more to be done. "Take him away. Do what you ask." The Roman soldiers advanced, seizing Jesus brutally. The prisoner, until then silent, remained serene. He knew that this moment was the fulfillment of the purpose for which he had come into the world. Pilate turned and entered back into the palace, not looking back. The weight of that decision would accompany him for the rest of his life. Pilate paced back and forth in the praetorium. The clamor of the crowd still echoed in his mind, and he knew the situation was spiraling out of control. He did not want to condemn Jesus to death, but he needed to find a middle ground that would satisfy the Jewish leaders without forcing him into a definitive execution. Then he had an idea. If Jesus were severely flogged, perhaps that would be enough to calm the fury of the people. He would order a brutal punishment, leaving Jesus unrecognizable, but still alive. Who knows, upon seeing his pitiful condition, the Sanhedrin might be satisfied. Pilate turned to a centurion and spoke firmly, "Take him and scourge him." Without mercy. The soldier thumped his chest in obedience and dragged Jesus out of the praetorium, leading him to the courtyard of the Antonia fortress, where Roman punishments were carried out. The stone floor was covered with dried bloodstains, remnants of previous punishments. Jesus, exhausted and already injured from the abuses suffered throughout the night, could barely stand. The Roman soldiers, accustomed to such rituals of torture, threw him against a stone column, binding his wrists above his head. One of the soldiers approached, bringing the flagrum, a short whip made of intertwined leather strips with pieces of metal, bone, and lead. Each strike of this instrument not only cut the skin, but tore the flesh, leaving deep lacerations. The centurion in charge of the punishment positioned himself and raised the whip. Around him, the other soldiers smiled, enjoying the spectacle. "Come on, show this king of the Jews what happens to those who defy Rome." The first blow fell violently, making Jesus tremble. His skin opened instantly, and the sound of the impact echoed through the courtyard. He closed his eyes, but did not let out a single scream. The second blow came with even more force, followed by another and another. The soldiers alternated their attacks, ensuring that every part of his back, shoulders, and legs was struck. The flagrum stuck to the flesh before being pulled brutally. Jesus staggered with each blow, but remained standing. His body was already covered in blood, and the ground beneath him began to turn red. The crowd watched from afar, part horrified, part satisfied with the punishment. The soldiers, on the other hand, laughed among themselves, seeing how far they could push him before he fainted. "This one is strong. Let's see how long he can take it. Where is your power now, prophet? Aren't you going to curse us?" Another blow. And another. Jesus' strength began to wane. His legs trembled, and his breathing became irregular. The centurion raised his hand, ordering them to stop. The soldiers, panting, threw the whips to the ground and stepped back, admiring their work. Jesus was still standing, but barely. His body was covered in deep cuts, and blood flowed freely, staining his already dirty cloak. The centurion raised his hand, ordering them to stop. The flogging had ended, but for the Roman soldiers, Jesus' suffering was still not enough. They did not see an innocent man there, nor even a condemned prisoner. To them, Jesus was an object of mockery, someone who dared to call himself king, and who now deserved to be ridiculed until the end. Jesus was untied from the column where he had been scourged. His legs barely supported him, his slumped shoulders showed the weight of the pain he already bore. Blood flowed down his body, mixing with sweat and the dust of the ground. The soldiers dragged him to a space inside the Antonia fortress, where the troops usually rested and where they could entertain themselves at the expense of the condemned. One of them had an idea. "If this guy is a king, he needs a crown," he mocked, grabbing a bundle of twisted thorns. The thorns were long and sharp, some as thick as needles, others curved like small spears. They were twisted and intertwined into a rustic circle. When it was ready, one of the soldiers walked up to Jesus and, without hesitation, pressed the crown against his head. The thorns pierced his skin and penetrated his scalp. Some embedded deeply, causing thin streams of blood to flow down his face, mixing with sweat and forming small red trails to his chin. Another soldier pulled an old, worn dark red cloak from a chest. This type of cloak was worn by high-ranking soldiers or Roman officials, and now it would serve as a garment of mockery for Jesus. They wrapped him in the heavy fabric, pressing it against his torn back. The contact of the exposed skin with the coarse cloth felt like fire burning his wounds. Jesus clenched his lips, but did not make a sound. "And a king also needs a scepter," shouted one of the guards, taking a piece of cane and placing it in Jesus' hands. The troop began to laugh and applaud. The soldiers knelt before him in false gestures of reverence. "Hail, King of the Jews!" they shouted, amidst laughter and scorn. One of the soldiers approached and spat in Jesus' face. The saliva dripped down his already bloodied and dusty face. Another soldier took the cane from his hands and, with a sharp blow, struck his head, driving the thorns deeper into his flesh. Jesus remained motionless. His body trembled from blood loss, from immeasurable pain, but his mouth remained closed. His eyes, despite everything, did not overflow with hatred or revolt. The soldiers, tired of the game, ripped the cloak from his back. The fabric, now stuck to the dried blood wounds, pulled at the skin when removed, reopening the deep cuts from the flogging. They laughed as they dragged him back to Pilate. When Jesus was brought back to the praetorium, Pilate was already impatient. He wanted to close the case. He wanted to find a way to rid himself of the responsibility that weighed on his shoulders. But when he saw Jesus again, he was shocked. The man before him now looked unrecognizable. His face was swollen, covered in bruises and cuts. His eyes were half open, his mouth slightly ajar as if struggling to breathe. Dry blood covered his skin, mixed with dust and sweat. Pilate felt a chill run down his spine. He turned to the crowd still shouting outside. He knew that if he let Jesus live, he might be awakening the wrath of the Jews. But if he condemned him, he would be condemning an innocent man. He looked at Jesus again. That man, despite everything, did not look like a criminal. Not a rebel leader. Not a lunatic. He looked like something else. Pilate made a decision. He went out to the courtyard where the people were gathered. The midday sun burned down on their heads. Dust rose as the impatient feet of the crowd moved. Pilate took a deep breath and gestured for them to bring Jesus. 2 Roman guards dragged him forward. The governor raised his hand and pointed at him. Behold the man. He waited for the sight of Jesus in that condition to generate compassion in the crowd. He hoped that the priests and the people would be satisfied. But there was no mercy. The silence lasted only a few seconds before the shouts returned, even more intense. Crucify him! Crucify him! Pilate's heart tightened. He realized, right there, that there was no escape. He was no longer in control of the situation. Jesus' fate was sealed. The sky was beginning to turn pale as the city of Jerusalem awoke to a day that would never be forgotten. The cries of the crowd still echoed through the narrow streets. In the dusty courtyard of the Roman governor's palace, the centurion announces the sentence to Jesus. The crowd murmurs anxiously as he proclaims the punishment. "You are to be crucified," he states, his voice like gravel crunching underfoot. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" The decision had been made. Pontius Pilate had washed his hands of Jesus, handing him over to the Roman soldi. In the courtyard of the Praetorium, the smell of sweat and blood mingled with the cold morning air. The lashes had already torn his skin, leaving deep wounds that bled uncontrollably. His tunic, now soaked in blood, clung to his thin, weakened body. Jesus' eyes were downcast, but his soul remained steadfast. 2 Roman soldiers approach with the wooden cross. They drop it before Jesus' feet with a heavy thud. One soldier, with a smirk, nudges Jesus with the end of his spear. "Take it," he commands, his tone laced with disdain. Jesus, despite his wounds, bends down slowly and takes hold of the cross, his hands trembling. The sun is relentless, pouring heat onto those gathered. Jesus adjusts the cross on his shoulders, grimacing at the sharp pain that runs down his back. Mary, his mother, watches from the edges of the crowd, her eyes filled with tears, but her face resolute in silent support. As they begin to walk, the throng of people shuffle alongside. Some mock, others weep. "The King of the Jews," a voice shouts sarcastically from the masses. Sweat drips down Jesus' face, mixing with the blood, yet his eyes remain focused on what lies ahead. A sudden falter in his step. Jesus stumbles under the weight of the cross, knees hitting the scorching ground. A hush falls over some of the crowd as a soldier grumbles and yanks him back up roughly. "Keep moving, or we'll drag you," the soldier scolds impatiently. They near the city gates. The air is thick with dust and the echo of footsteps. As they pass through, a sense of foreboding casts its shadow over the onlookers. Some women openly weep, calling out for Jesus. "We mourn for you," a voice cries out, filled with sorrow. The climb to Golgotha begins. The path is steep and treacherous. Jesus' breathing is ragged, but there's a strange strength in his eyes. A little ahead, 2 condemned criminals catch sight of him, exchanging glances of grim recognition. Finally reaching the hill, the soldiers grow visibly impatient, eager to finish their grim task. The centurion surveys the scene, issuing orders. Jesus, now barely able to stand, gazes at the heavens, whispering a quiet prayer as the cross is laid down before him for the last time. The soldiers brought the cross. Heavy, "There is the king," mocked a Pharisee. "Where is your power now?" Jesus did not answer. He simply followed, one step after another, the cross getting heavier and heavier. The soldiers had no patience. Whips cracked in the air, striking his already destroyed back. "You there?" The soldier pointed. "Take the cross." Simon's eyes widened, frightened. "I? Now?" Hesitantly, Simon walked towards Jesus. He saw the state of the man in front of him. A face covered in blood and sweat. His eyes were tired, but still filled with something inexplicable. Without saying a word, Simon grabbed the cross and lifted it, feeling its crushing weight. Jesus looked at him for a moment and, with a subtle nod, thanked him. Together, they continued their walk. Amidst the crowd, a woman broke through the guards. Mary Magdalene, desperate, held a piece of white linen in her hands. Her heart ached to see the man she loved so much being treated with such cruelty. "Please," she whispered, coming closer. Before the soldiers could stop her, she brought the cloth to Jesus' bloody face. She gently wiped it over his forehead, his cheeks, his wounded mouth. He looked into her eyes, and for a moment, all the pain seemed to disappear. "Thank you," Jesus murmured weakly. The soldiers pulled her away abruptly. She fell to her knees, clutching the cloth to her chest. When she opened it, she saw the mark of their armor clinking like a funeral bell. Mary's eyes brimmed with unshed tears, her heart breaking with every stumble of her son. Above, the hill stood like a throne of sorrow, waiting to crown pain with nails and wood. The wooden cross weighed like the sin of the entire world, crushing his already wounded shoulders. Each step felt like an eternity, and pain was a constant companion, whispering for him to give up. As the scorching sun cast long shadows on the dusty path, Jesus walked with both pain and determination, carrying the weight of the cross on his shoulders. The shouts and jeers of the crowd filled the air, but none of the noise could drown out the silent, internal dialogue he maintained with himself. At intervals, the cross would weigh too heavily, and he would stagger, only to find the strength to continue. "Mother," he whispered as his eyes caught sight of Mary in the crowd. Her face was a portrait of pain and love, and as she pushed her way towards him, their eyes locked. "Oh, my son," Mary said, tears glistening in her eyes, her voice trembling with sorrow. "Remember, you are the light. Your strength is eternal." Jesus nodded, a small, faint smile playing on his lips, offering her the only comfort he could muster. "Mother, my time has come to fulfill what I was chosen for." agony, turned slightly towards them. Speaking to the repentant one, he said softly, "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." As the grueling journey progressed, each step seemed an eternity. Sweat mixed with blood from the crown of thorns adorning Jesus' brow, carving tiny rivers down his face. The hill of Calvary stood intimidatingly close now. Upon reaching the summit, the Roman soldiers seized Jesus, tearing away his garments and exposing him to the unforgiving sun. The fabric of his tunic split in their rough hands, leaving him bare. Jesus lay back on the cross, the rough wood biting into his skin. The end of this path isn't yet far, far from his mind. The crowd gathered around, awaiting the hammer's fall. In this moment of silence, the world seemed to hold its breath, a moment suspended in time, laden with both impending tragedy and unfathomable hope. Jesus. Loomed before the city as a grim reminder of death. The site was not named for its rocky shape resembling a human skull alone, but also for its dark reputation as a frequent scene of public executions. A metallic smell of old blood still lingered in the air, as if the stones absorbed the pain of the condemned who perished there. Crowds gathered around the hill. Some were curious, others indifferent. Many were excited, thirsty for spectacle. There were Pharisees with stern faces, bored soldiers, mothers with children on their shoulders trying to see something, and even disciples hidden in the shadows, weeping silently. Everyone wanted to see the Nazarene, the man who claimed to be the Son of God, defeated. Beside Jesus, two criminals were also being led to execution. There was no doubt about their crimes, their faces bore the weight of their ruined lives. One of them walked muttering words of contempt, the other could barely lift his face. They were condemned by the empire, despised by the people, forgotten by hope. And yet, they would share the scene of crucifixion with the purest man who ever walked among men. When they finally reached the top of Golgotha, the scene was barren, dark, and cruel. The sun seemed more intense. Just execution. Dust rose as Jesus' exhausted body hit the ground, his knees torn from the weight of suffering. Two Roman soldiers, expressionless, struggled to lift the rough, blood-stained cross. In the background, a heavy silence hung over the crowd, as if time itself had stopped. A sepulchral silence fell over the mount as the Roman soldiers, trained in brutality, prepared for the cruelest act of the entire execution, the fastening of Jesus to the cross. The rough timber lay stretched on the ground, stained by other deaths and now destined to bear the weight of the Son of God himself. Jesus, already exhausted and the soldiers stretched Jesus' arm over the rough wood, tying his wrist with a thick, filthy rope that bled even before the nail touched. Pulling the rope tied to his wrist with brutality, the Romans dislocated his arm with a dry crack. Bones, tendons, and nerves tore apart in a single scream that shattered the silence. As if conversing with the Father in a language only they understood. The pain coursed through every fiber of his being, yet his expression remained serene, as if in perfect peace. The blood slowly trickled, mixing with the sweat, marking the path of redemption. Then, the soldiers moved down to his feet. They joined them over the vertical timber, bending one knee over the other, and another nail was positioned. The hammer came down. The pain was now complete. Jesus' body trembled, yet his gaze never wavered from the heavens. The sound of the hammer echoed like a final decree, sealing his sacrifice in a moment of unbearable agony. The world seemed to fall silent around him, as if time had stopped to witness that sacrifice. Each breath was a weight, each heartbeat a battle, but his faith remained unwavering, a beacon of hope for all who watched. Each strike seemed to echo not only across the mount, but through the ages, traversing centuries and hearts. Blood gushed in thick streams, running down his hands, wrists, and feet, staining the wood with the purest sacrifice ever offered. The cross, a symbol of death, began to transform into a symbol of life. The soldiers, insensible, merely fulfilled their mission. Some smiled sarcastically, others were apathetic, oblivious to the greatness of the moment they were witnessing. The crowd watched. Some turned their faces in horror, others applauded or laughed, and many simply stared at Jesus as if trying to understand what was one who called himself the Son of God. For them, the cross was the end. For heaven, it was the beginning. Dust rose in the hot air, mingled with the smell of blood, sweat, and raw wood. The vultures were already beginning to circle, like sentinels of death. But what lingered in the atmosphere was not just death, it was a cosmic tension, as if the universe were in internal war, divided between justice and mercy. Up above, Jesus' eye swept over the crowd. He saw them. Each one of them. The mockers, the indifferent, the afflicted, the guilty, the lost. He saw beyond flesh and only bled, but now officially bore the title that men so feared and denied, King. Not from a throne of gold, but from a throne of pain, sacrifice, and redemption. To the left and right of Jesus, two other men were nailed. They were criminals, to the divine plan. When Jesus was crucified, the soldiers divided his clothes among themselves, a gesture of disrespect towards the one who was in the most humiliating moment of his existence. However, Jesus' seamless tunic was a piece of greater value. her son's pain. Her heart shattered with every blow, with every insult hurled in his direction. The suffering of a mother, seeing her son being brutally treated, cannot be fully understood, but Mary lived this pain as few mothers could comprehend. Her face was marked by tears, but her exhausted, could barely resist any longer. The physical anguish culminates in a deep and anguished cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" With these words, Jesus recites the beginning of Psalm 22, a lament of despair, but also a prophecy of Jesus surrenders his life to the Father. In complete surrender, he says, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." These words are not of despair, but of total surrender. They indicate that, despite all the pain, Jesus was in full obedience to the Father. By uttering these words, he submits to the end of his earthly mission, confident that the Father would receive his spirit. With that, Jesus bowed his head and died. The body, now inert, hung from the cross. His sacrifice, incomprehensible, redeeming all humanity. When Jesus gave up his spirit, something supernatural happened, revealing the cosmic impact of his death. The sky, which had seemed calm before, suddenly darkened, as if creation itself was in mourning. Darkness enveloped the earth, covering Golgotha and all its surroundings. The sun hid for several hours, and the stars, usually distant, seemed somehow closer, as if the entire universe was becoming aware of the monumental event taking place. The silence of nature echoed humanity's terror in the face of that irreparable curse. After the sky darkened, a heavy silence fell over all, but Mary remained at the foot of the cross, her eyes filled with sorrow and her heart torn apart. Even without strength, she refused to look away from her suffering son. In this moment of anguish and darkness, the earth trembled violently. The rocks split, and the dead, who lay in tombs, rise up. The ground seems to swallow such, and the sky, engulfed in darkness, reflects pain and loss. This earthquake is not a natural phenomenon, but a visible sign of the rupture of the world and the birth of something new. Creation, in some way, felt the death of the Son of God, and this tremor is a reflection of the spiritual transformation that had occurred at that moment. Inside the Temple of Jerusalem, however, another awful miracle took place. The veil of the Holy of Holies, which separated the place where man could not enter, tears from top to bottom. This veil, which symbolized the separation between the sinful man and the holiness of God, now dissolves, showing the world that the death of Jesus had eliminated the barrier between humanity and the Creator. Access to God, once restricted to a single priest, was now open to all who wished to approach him in faith. It was the end of the old covenant and the beginning of the new, where the perfect sacrifice of Christ made reconciliation with God possible for all. The impact of this moment, although grand, also struck the heart of a man who was there, watching, a Roman centurion. This officer, likely accustomed to the brutality and violence of the events he witnessed daily, was deeply touched by the death of Jesus. He saw the earthquake, heard the cries of anguish, and finally perceived the innocence and dignity of Jesus, who had died without complaint, without revolt, without vengeance. The centurion, in a moment of clarity, looked at the cross and declared, "Truly, this was the Son of God." His words were not merely a simple observation, they marked a profound recognition of Jesus' divinity, something that, for a Roman, meant an opening of heart to a completely new concept. This testimony, coming from a pagan man, would become one of the first recognitions in the Roman world that Jesus was indeed the Son of God. It would sow the seeds of Christian faith in the hearts of many others who would later convert. These supernatural signs, the earthquake, the darkness, and the tearing of the veil, were not just manifestations of suffering, but also of a cosmic change. The death of Jesus was not the body fell into the arms of the men like a sacred burden. Mary, the mother, watched in silence, her eyes swollen from crying, her face stained with tears and dust. Beside her, some faithful women wept. impact of faith than the swords of the Romans. Pilate, perhaps tired of their insistence, replied coldly, "You have a guard. Go and secure it as you wish." And so, under the crescent moon, a Roman detachment was sent to the tomb. Men in The silence of the tomb was broken as, bathed in a gentle light, Jesus opened his eyes and took a deep breath, as if awakening from an eternal sleep. But what happened after that miraculous moment is a revelation to be told in the next chapter.